welcome to another episode of JTV. Today we're joined by, I think this is going to be probably one of my favourite guests. 2 years ago, I met Charlotte Korchak. I think it was 2 years ago, pretty much to this day.
Yeah, about 3 days ago.
Yeah, pretty much to this day. And I texted one of your colleagues at StandWithUs, which is where you work, and I said, wow, this is the best Israel advocate I've ever seen. And it's been 2 years since that point, and I still stand by that statement.
Thank you.
Charlotte Korchak is the senior educator at StandWithUs, and she is just a brilliant spokesperson for the cause of Israel and Zionism, and I'm so excited to be able to share her with you today on JTV. So Charlotte, you were raised in America, in LA, and then you came to Israel when you were how old?
9 years old.
9 years old.
Yeah.
And you had some experiences of, well, you were really living during the Second Intifada in Israel.
Yeah, first 3 years were relatively quiet. I say relatively, suicide bombing there, suicide bombing here.
Yeah.
But it started 3 years in. It started in the year 2000. I moved there in 1997 as a 9-year-old, yeah.
And you lost some of your closest friends to terrorists.
I wouldn't say closest. I don't want to exaggerate, but during my first year in Israel, I got very close with an individual. She was definitely my best friend at the time. She was my rock, and she really got me through my first year. We had lost touch at that point, but yeah, a few years later, her, along with two others who I knew from my community, were murdered in a suicide bombing or a homicide bombing. They were out eating pizza on a Saturday night, and a suicide bomber walked up to a group of them and blew himself up. They were 14 years old. Two of them were 14. My friend, I was very close with that first year, she was 15. And everyone who was injured were also about 14, 15 years old.
And was there a story where you nearly got on the bus, which eventually...
Yeah, June 18th, 2002, it was actually it was significant to me, but also ended up being a very significant bombing in general. I got on a bus, the bus that I usually take to school, and passed through a bus stop where no one was, and 10 minutes later, a suicide bomber had appeared at that bus stop and got on the bus after mine. He killed, I believe it was 15 people from my community. It might have been 17. It was coming out of the Gilo neighborhood in Jerusalem. And why I say it was significant to me, really more to my family, because for about an hour there, my family couldn't get a hold of me, and they all thought that I had been killed. For the world, for Israel, it was the bombing that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Ariel Sharon, our prime minister at the time, who after that bombing decided to build the security barrier in Israel, which upon its construction started to reduce terror, and today has reduced terrorism by over 90%.
But what does all this do to your association with living in Israel? And does it embolden you, or does it destroy you?
Oh God, it definitely doesn't destroy me. It was hard. I think where it affected me most, and I always bring it up whenever I introduce myself in a lecture, because, I've tried now after so many years to come at this conflict from a very academic, factual place rather than from an emotional place. But it is so important to understand that it started for me as very emotional. Yeah. I remember the moment when I saw their faces in the newspaper. I remember the moment I got the phone call. I remember burying their bodies. And that does something to you as a 14-year-old. And I think the one thing that I'll always remember is that there will always be people who are trying to kill us. Right. And so I keep that in mind as well. But I do try to put it aside when it comes to the facts and really hone in and be factual about things. But yeah, there is an emotional piece, and there's a human toll that this conflict plays. And it definitely emboldens me. It strengthens me. I tell their story, and it's one of countless stories of Israelis who have lost people in this conflict, and Palestinians who have lost people in this conflict. And those are stories that need to be told, because as much as we can focus on the facts and look at it, from the outside and look at it from above, we have to acknowledge the human toll and how challenging it is going to be to break through that pain and that suffering, to find a way to let go of it and make peace.
And the story that you tell me, which I find so, in contrast to all this, I find so amusing, is that when you first went to college in America, you went to USC.
University of Southern California, Fadon, Trojans.
and you when you first came onto campus, you saw like a big wall representing the Israeli, what they claim to be an apartheid wall. Yeah. And you just completely lost it. And I find it so funny because that's just the complete opposite of the Charlotte that I know today, which is so articulate. And this was your first encounter with thinking about Israel advocacy. You basically just shouted at the people, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was crying. I was emotional. I had never, it wasn't right when I got on campus. It was about 6 months into my first year at USC in 2006. And I lost it. I was very upset, and I didn't have facts. No one sat me down and taught me all this stuff. Right. And so what I had only was 3 years earlier, I had buried 3 of my friends, and I watched so many Israelis bury family members, and that was all I could comment on. That was all I had. So it was definitely not the person that I am today. And the perspective that I have has changed because, again, I was only looking at one side. I was only looking at the Israeli side. I was only looking at the pain and the suffering of Israelis. And I have actively tried in the last 13 years since that time to really try to zoom out and see this conflict from all perspectives, from as many perspectives as I can get. And I'm going to continue to do that, and I encourage everybody to do that. Right. Because if I was still that kid, I would not be the person that I am today, and I would not have the empathy that I have today for the other side, and I would not be able to talk about Palestinians the way that I do today. Still very much carrying with me everything that I went through and that Israelis have gone through. But yeah, it was definitely a different Charlotte.
After that, you began to
educate
yourself.
Yes, I think first of all, I was an activist, and I think activism is not always about, diving deep into the facts and having nuanced conversations. Unfortunately, sometimes it is about the headlines and about the sound bites. But eventually, when I had the time to finally start reading for pleasure after I got out of school and I started working for StandWithUs 9.5 years ago, I was able to really start to do my own research and really read books that started to make me uncomfortable about my history and pushed me out of my comfort zone. And then when I moved to Israel and started to guide groups in Israel, both in the classroom and then also take them out into the field, I had the opportunity to meet Palestinians and sit in their homes and talk to them about their lives and their reality and how they see things. And I think all of that is so incredibly important. And I didn't have that opportunity, except I will say, the one thing that my parents very much, not the one of many things that my parents gave me was when I was growing up in Israel, even with all of that, I did know Palestinians. When I was young, I went to Jericho, and I'll never forget driving into Jericho with my family and visiting a friend of my father's who happened to be the ex-mayor of Ramallah. Oh, wow. And I sat in their home, and we had friends who lived in East Jerusalem, and we would go to their home, and we would sit there, and we'd have dinner with them, and we'd talk to them. And so I was exposed to I don't want to call it the other side. I was exposed to my neighbors, the Arabs who live in Jerusalem, Palestinians who live in the West Bank. And so it wasn't black and white for me. Right. And because of that foundation, I think it was a lot easier for me later on in life to then dive into that story a little bit more. But I would encourage every young Jew or Zionist to very much open themselves up to that. You will only truly understand this whole conflict when you understand their story as well. And that it will make you uncomfortable, and maybe it'll make you angry. But it's an important, important thing to do if you want to fully be able to understand the reality on the ground and see this conflict not just through your own eyes, but through somebody else's eyes and through maybe the world's eyes as well. So I very much encourage that. And come to Israel, come to Stand With Us. We're there. We do this. We take people around, and we sit in the classroom and we talk about it, and we hear from Palestinians and we hear from Israelis, and we try to open people up a little bit more to the full reality on the ground and as many perspectives as we can possibly expose them to. So yeah.
Charlotte, let's just jump into some of the big claims, misconceptions that surround the whole debate around what's going on in Israel and what's happened over the last 70 years. Sure. Some would even say 2,000 years, 3,000 years, however far you want to, however far you want to go back. So the first thing I want to do, let's really go back to one of the oldest arguments and discussions, which is actually, I don't know if this has always been relevant in the Israel discussion, but I'm certainly seeing it come up more now, which is the issue of people who support Israel and Jewish people who say that we have the right to the land of Israel because we're indigenous and we are the indigenous population. And I want to explore that a little bit. And I want to ask, is that really a fair argument to make? Because Native Americans could make the same claim about Manhattan. and and they can't take back Manhattan. So how do we make sense of that? And yeah, I just want you to explore that a little bit, because it seems like it's a bit almost disingenuous when we make that argument, because
Sure.
Otherwise you could apply that to so many countries.
Sure. Well, first of all, let's talk about Jewish indigeneity.
Okay.
I think it's hard to argue that Jews aren't indigenous to the land of Israel. Mm-hmm. And when I say land of Israel, that also means the land that was then named Palestine by the Romans back in the early centuries of the Common Era. We're indigenous. What does that mean? That means that we, as the Jewish people, which we are, we're a people. We're not just a religion. We're not just an ethnicity. We're a people. We have shared history. We have shared values. We have shared culture, language, and we also share a land. And that land is that land of Israel. Our culture, our traditions, our language all stem from that place, making us indigenous to that land. Now, why we are oftentimes different from other indigenous peoples, and why it's hard sometimes for people to acknowledge us as an indigenous people, is because we are an indigenous people that for the last 2,000 years have been living in exile. And unlike other indigenous peoples, like for example, the Native Americans, like you brought up, the Native Americans, yes, they lived in places like Manhattan or Muncie or other places in New York, and they eventually were expelled or moved from those places, but they stayed on the continent of North America, and they ended up tragically on reservations, and much of their land was stolen from them by the British colonialists who came in, who eventually became...
It wasn't just us British. Come on.
Well,
let's not put all the blame on us.
That's true. The originals were the Europeans, and they were expelled, and their land was taken from them, much like what happened to the Jews. Yes, for us, it happened a lot further back. And so sometimes it's hard for people to go back that far in history and try to say that plays any relevance in today's world. But as Jews, that's the only place we can call home. And so when in the 19th century, Jews started to look for a different future for themselves and realized, we had suffered 1900 years of persecution, and we wanted to end that persecution somehow. And we sought independence, we sought liberation. And when that conversation came up, the only place that many people thought that made sense was the land of Israel, because it's the only place that we can call home. And so nowadays when people say to me, I get it, fine, you guys might have needed a country, but why did it have to be there? My response is, where else? Everywhere we went, you told us to go somewhere else. Everywhere we went, we were expelled, or we were massacred, or we were killed, or genocide. It was just, where else would you like us to go?
Didn't some people want maybe Uganda or something like that?
Yes, they did, and I love that argument.
Did you see the video with the Ugandan president? We posted it on JTV 3 years ago. It was commemorating the whole Entebbe raid, and the Ugandan president said, well, I heard that you guys were thinking of potentially setting up a Jewish state in Uganda, and well, it's lucky you guys didn't, because otherwise we'd be fighting you now.
Exactly. That's exactly the point, right? And that's funny. I don't think I saw that, but the irony is that when people say that, I don't know if it's irony, but the funny part about it is, if we had gone to Uganda, which was offered to us by, I'm pretty sure it was the British, we would have been colonialists. We would have been foreigners. Maybe not colonialists because we didn't really have a place we were colonizing from, right? We're Jews. We were wandering Jews. We don't have a home base. Our home base is now Israel. But we would have definitely been foreigners. We could not have argued that this was our land and that we belonged there. Whereas with Israel, we can always make that argument because it's true. Today, after 1900 years, 2000 years of living in exile, we returned home. And that language that I say, which is our common language, which a lot of people say, what do you mean it's your language? Look, we're sitting here speaking English. But it's because we lived in exile and we adapted to our surroundings. And so I was born in the United States, so I spoke English, and you were born here, and so you speak English. But our language is Hebrew. And when we went home, the argument was, we have to revive this language, because there's no way that when the Jews finally returned back to their historic homeland, that in this place where our language came to be, that we would speak any other language but Hebrew. And we revived the Hebrew language in our historic homeland. So much of this points to our indigeneity. Now, does that mean that we have full claims to this land and that nobody else is allowed to live there or should live there? No. But I think the argument is that we do have a right to live there.
But so you're saying, in other words, if you have people that are indigenous and they get kicked out and they want to return, if it's workable, they have the right to do it. But you're saying if it's not workable, like in America, then what?
Again, I don't know if they have the right to it. I think that if it's workable, then do it. Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
And I think that's hard, unfortunately, in a lot of instances. And I think we as Jews, I have to say, I think we were very lucky. with the reality that we had, that the land that we came to didn't have a lot of people living in it. There were people living in it, but there weren't that many people living in it.
This brings me to the next point, which was some people said, I can't remember who said the particular saying, that Israel was a land without a people for a people without a land.
Yeah.
And that was said, I think, as Israel was being formed, basically.
Well, before, it was about in the 1900s,
Okay.
or the 1800s, excuse me, when Jews started to immigrate there. There was this concept of, well, this is the best place because there's nobody living there.
Was that really true?
Well, no, I think a lot of people like to go back to like Mark Twain, who, in his travels through this area, he talked about this barren, empty land with very little of a population. And I think people kind of cued that because they had never been there. And so they were listening to somebody who had and said, oh, there aren't that many people living there. Not that it was a completely empty land, but if you look in the mid 1800s, we have about 400,000 people living there on a land that today holds 9 million and can hold many more.
Right.
And so in many people's terms, that would be a pretty barren land.
Right.
Now, that being said, we can't ignore the fact that that still means that 370,000 non-Jews were living in this land and very much consider it home, regardless of how long they had lived there or if they're indigenous or not. They consider it home. And so this was, I would say, a challenge within the Jewish narrative of, well, we came to an empty land, because it wasn't empty. And eventually those people who were living there and their descendants, and then other people like them who will immigrate in over the years, will eventually be in conflict with us as a result of all of this.
But again, the issue of indigeneity, you're saying it doesn't necessarily give you a right to a piece of land, but you're saying it emboldens your claim.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And you're saying, but if nothing can be done about it, like in America, in those instances, well, compensation is in order.
Sure,
that kind of stuff is in
reparations,
order. Yeah, in other words,
autonomy of some sort,
Right.
Native Americans today, and this isn't my expertise, and I don't want to claim that it is, but Israel is my expertise. But Native Americans today live on reservations. Now, is that is that making up for the fact that much of them were killed and their populations have been decimated as a result of all of this? But now they get to live on reservations and they have a semblance of autonomy. Federal law is not their law. Is that enough? I don't know. And I'm not one to judge justice of history. It's sad. It's a sad reality of everything that happened. But I think for the Jewish people, we very clearly demonstrated that we needed a place to go. And when we went home, we did so legally. We moved in legally. We bought land at exorbitant prices from Arab landowners who sold it to us. And they knew that they could because they knew that we would pay the price. And we did. And so we immigrated there legally in the beginning. Now, did it always end well? It didn't. It didn't. We moved to lands that oftentimes we had purchased this land from absentee landowners who were living somewhere else in the Ottoman Empire, because this was all happening under Ottoman Empire control. And when we would show up to that land, sometimes there would be people living there. And they might have been living there for decades. And then these Jews show up who look foreign, even though we would argue, well, we're not. The reason I look the way that I do today, 2,000 years later, is because, well, my people were colonized 2,000 years ago and expelled from our homeland. Our land was colonized and we were kicked out and sent to Europe.
Why would that change the way we look, though?
Well, because we made our way to Europe, and after 2,000 years, you eventually start to adopt the phenotypes of the people of the place that you're living in.
Is that what happens?
Yeah, and you adapt and you marry, and people marry in.
Right.
And slowly but surely, you develop different ethnotypes. And that's why we have Jews who look like me and you.
Right.
But we also have Ethiopian Jews who are black. We have Middle Eastern Jews who look Semitic, who are much darker than me and you. And that's why it's complicated or confusing for a lot of people, because they look at Jews and they say, well, you guys are all different colors, and you guys are all, and you practice your religion in a lot of different ways. So how can you argue that you're one people? And again, the argument is we're a people who have been living in exile. And so we showed up and we looked, again, European, we looked foreign as far as they were concerned. We were European. We were not Semitic. We weren't natives of this land that we had arrived in. And all of a sudden it was like, well, we own this land now and you need to leave. And that will feel to anybody like their land is being taken from them. Even if, again, you could look at the legality of it and it was done legally.
We'll
but
get into that.
Perception of fact, I think, is still, perception of reality is still very important.
Yeah.
And the narrative of the Palestinians, which is that this land was stolen from us, very much will start here, because that's what it felt like.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna get into that.
Yeah, and that really wasn't the intention. It's hard to find anything in early writings of Zionists that said that we were moving there and we were going to kick off the population that was living there. In fact, I think most people arrived there not expecting there to be a population there.
Right.
And then there was one. And we slowly but surely had to learn how to deal and how to live side by side with that population. And by the way, in some instances, we lived with them very well. There were Arabs throughout this territory that really welcomed the Jews, and we were able to settle side by side. As nationalism grew, more and more tension will grow as well.
And could the Arab population that lived in the land, could they make the claim of being indigenous as well?
So I don't like to play fast and loose with terms.
Yeah.
And I think indigenous has a very specific definition, and I think the Jews fit it to a T, and you can ask other indigenous rights activists, and I think they would say the same. The Arabs are indigenous to the Arabian Peninsula. They speak Arabic, that their culture, their language, their tradition stemmed from there. And there was Arab conquest and expansion that happened really with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. And that's when Arabs will make their way from the Arabian Peninsula into the land of Israel, or Palestine at that time, again, named by the Romans, a territory on a map, never a distinctive place with distinctive borders. And so, no, you can't argue. I think it would be very hard to argue, to make the argument that they're indigenous. Now, again, let's go to perception. Do they feel native to that land? Yeah, some of them do, because after a few hundred years, or even 1,000 years, if we're talking about the 7th century, they've lived there for that amount of time. And how long does it take to feel connected to a land, right? I call myself American. Americans have only been something for 240 plus years. And that doesn't make me any less American or any less connected to the land that is the United States of America today. And so the Arabs who live there, not indigenous, but very much do they have a claim to say, we have a long-standing presence here, and we do feel native and connected to this land, and this land is ours. The same way that the Jews would say, this land is ours, because we have also a long-standing claim, 3,000 years of continuous Jewish presence in that land, as well as 2,000 years, 2,500 years of Jewish connection to that land from far away, which was called Zionism up until, it was modernized by Herzl in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so Jews abroad, even if we weren't able to live there, we prayed in that direction. And in our prayers, we spoke about Israel. At our weddings, the last thing that we have to do is acknowledge that we're not home. And we say, if I forget Jerusalem, it's as if I have forgotten my right hand. It was in our liturgy. It was throughout all of our texts. We spoke about this territory as home. And we always spoke about one day returning to it. And so I think both of us have a claim. And I think that's the challenge today, is how do we reconcile both of those claims to this land, where today you have about 6.5 million on each side living in this land.
Would you say the claims are equally compelling?
That's not up for me to say. That's not up for me to say. I think everyone can judge that for themselves. You know what I mean? It's 1,000 years, 1,300 years for some Arabs. For Jews, it's 3,000 years. It's constant connection, but it's not for me to say. I think that's such an individual, personal thing. Go talk to Jews about their land. Go talk to Palestinians today about how they feel about the land, and make that judgment for yourself.
Okay.
But I would say, regardless, we have two people living on the same land today, and no one has either intention of going anywhere.
Right.
So
right.
The notion that one might be more compelling than the other, does it really ultimately matter when we look forward and try to figure out a resolution? Because neither one of us is going anywhere.
Right.
Unless this happened in a disgusting, violent, brutal way. And I don't know about them, but I know that I have no intention of allowing that to happen. And I don't think most Israelis have any intention of allowing that to happen. So we have to figure out a solution, even with these two claims, regardless of how compelling each one is.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.